He told her, "Handle it yourself," and walked away, but 3 years later, the millionaire CEO saw her at a bus stop, with twins who had his eyes. Ethan Blake was the kind of man people whispered about when he walked into a room, the one who carried an aura of power so strong that others stepped aside without thinking. His days were consumed by meetings, negotiations, and numbers that ran higher than most people could imagine, and he thrived on the relentless pace of it all. To him, success was measured in acquisitions, stock prices, and the ever-growing empire he had built from the ground up. Emily, his girlfriend, had once been the gentle balance to his ruthless ambition, but over the months she had grown tired of being left behind, tired of being treated as if she were just another detail to fit between appointments. When she found out she was pregnant, she thought maybe this would change things. She believed that telling Ethan would awaken something in him, that deep down he would be ready to create a family and step away, even if just a little, from his endless chase for success. But the day she asked him to come to the ultrasound, he didn't even look up from his phone at first. His assistant hovered in the doorway with a folder full of contracts, and Ethan's mind was already 3 steps ahead in a deal that would cement his company's dominance. "I'm busy, handle it yourself," he said casually, as if the moment meant nothing, as if her trembling voice and wide eyes weren't begging for him to see her. Emily's heart sank in that instant, because she realized he hadn't heard the unspoken words in her request, that she needed him, not as a CEO, not as the man who conquered boardrooms, but as the father of the life growing inside her. She stood there for a moment longer, waiting for him to reconsider, but he had already returned to his screen, nodding along as his assistant updated him on the numbers. The silence between them felt colder than any rejection. Emily left the office, fighting to keep her composure until she was out of sight. As she stepped into the elevator, her vision blurred with tears. She placed a protective hand on her stomach, whispering softly to the unborn child that she would never abandon them, no matter how hard it got. In that moment, she knew she was choosing a path of loneliness and struggle, but also one of love. Ethan, meanwhile, barely noticed she had gone. He convinced himself that she would calm down, that she would accept the life he could provide from a distance without needing his presence at something as trivial as an ultrasound. In his mind, responsibilities like children were distractions that toppled empires. He told himself he was doing the right thing, that freedom and focus were worth more than anything else. But a small, almost imperceptible voice inside him, the one he drowned out with work and arrogance, asked whether he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. That evening, Emily sat in her small apartment, the ultrasound appointment card still clutched in her hand. She stared at it with trembling fingers and realized she would have to walk into that room alone. The thought terrified her, but beneath the fear was a stubborn strength. If Ethan had chosen not to be part of this journey, then she would carry the burden herself. She would protect her child, no matter the cost. And in that decision, though she did not yet know it, Emily had set in motion a story that would one day shake Ethan's world to its core. Emily kept her promise to herself as she walked into the hospital alone for the ultrasound appointment. The sterile smell of disinfectant and the hushed conversations of nurses filled the air, but what she felt most was the heavy emptiness beside her. Other women in the waiting room clutched the hands of their husbands or boyfriends, smiling nervously as they whispered to each other, while Emily sat in silence, clutching her purse and staring at the floor. When the nurse finally called her name, she followed with her shoulders squared, determined not to let anyone see the ache inside her. The ultrasound room was dim, the glow of the screen the only light. Emily lay back on the bed, her heart racing as the doctor began the procedure. Within seconds, the rhythmic sound of tiny heartbeats filled the air. Her eyes widened in shock as the doctor smiled and said, "You're carrying twins." For a moment Emily couldn't breathe, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled up. 2 lives. 2 children who would depend on her completely. The thought was overwhelming, terrifying, but also miraculous. The sound of those heartbeats melted away the loneliness that had followed her since Ethan's rejection. She wasn't alone anymore. The following months tested her in ways she had never imagined. Pregnancy was difficult enough, but carrying twins while working full-time at a modest job pushed her to the edge. There were days when her legs ached from standing too long, nights when she cried from exhaustion, and mornings when she looked in the mirror and barely recognized the pale, tired woman staring back. Yet every time she felt the tiny kicks inside her, she remembered why she was enduring it all. She imagined their faces, their laughter, and the love she would give them. Ethan's absence was a constant shadow, but she forced herself to block it out. She no longer allowed herself to hope that he would suddenly appear and decide to stand by her. She had accepted the truth: he had made his choice, and she would make hers. Still, in the quiet moments, when she lay awake at night, she sometimes wondered what kind of father he could have been if only he had cared. The bitterness was sharp, but so was the determination to prove him wrong, to raise her children in a world of love without the coldness of his ambition. As her belly grew, so did her courage. She began preparing her small apartment for the babies, repainting the walls with her own hands, buying used furniture from neighbors, and sewing tiny clothes late at night by the dim light of her lamp. Each stitch, each brush of paint, felt like a declaration: "We will be okay." Her neighbors sometimes offered help, and though she was grateful, she preferred to carry the weight herself. She wanted to prove that she was capable, that she could give her daughters the life they deserved. When the day of delivery came, Emily was terrified, but the moment she heard her daughter's cries, all fear melted away. Two tiny girls, both with dark hair and the bluest eyes she had ever seen, lay swaddled in her arms. They looked so much like Ethan that it made her chest ache, but she pushed the thought away. These girls were hers, and she would not let his absence define them. She named them Lily and Sophie, whispering promises of love and protection as she kissed their tiny foreheads. In that hospital room, surrounded by machines and sterile walls, Emily knew her life had changed forever. She had not only become a mother but also found a strength she never knew she had. Emily's apartment transformed into a sanctuary of noise and love during the first 3 years of Lily and Sophie's lives. The once quiet space now echoed with laughter, cries, and the patter of tiny feet running across the wooden floor. The nights were the hardest at first, endless cycles of rocking both babies in her tired arms, singing lullabies until her voice cracked, and fighting back tears of exhaustion when neither child would sleep. Yet with each sunrise, no matter how little rest she had gotten, she found new energy in their smiles. Holding one daughter in each arm, she would look at their matching blue eyes, so bright and full of innocence, and tell herself that she was stronger than the fatigue, stronger than the loneliness, stronger than the doubts that still haunted her in the quiet hours of the night. Working full-time with twins had seemed impossible, but Emily found a way. She took on freelance work in the evenings after her shifts, scribbling notes with one hand while balancing a baby on her lap with the other. Friends and kind neighbors occasionally stepped in, offering to babysit or bring meals, and while she rarely asked for help, she learned to accept it with gratitude. Over time, she created a delicate rhythm between work, motherhood, and survival. Money was always tight, but she managed to make birthdays feel magical, even if it was just balloons and homemade cupcakes. The girls never seemed to notice the struggles. To them, their small apartment was a castle, and their mother, a queen. The twins grew with mirrored personalities but subtle differences that made Emily smile. Lily was bold, always the first to try new things, climbing onto chairs and attempting to dance long before she could keep her balance. Sophie was quieter, observing everything with wide, thoughtful eyes before following her sister's lead. Yet together, they were inseparable, holding hands when they toddled down the street, sharing toys, and speaking in a secret language only they seemed to understand. Emily often marveled at how their bond made them strong, how even without a father present, they never seemed to lack love. Despite her determination, Ethan's memory occasionally intruded. Strangers who saw the girls often commented on their striking resemblance to someone they must know, unaware of the wound those remarks reopened. Their dark hair and piercing blue eyes mirrored his too closely to ignore, and though Emily tried to focus on the present, there were times when she wondered if her daughters would one day ask why their father wasn't there. She rehearsed answers in her head but always stumbled, unsure of how to explain his absence without shattering their innocence. One rainy evening, as Emily sat at the kitchen table working while the girls played with building blocks on the floor, she overheard them whispering. Sophie asked where their daddy was, and Lily, in her bold way, answered, "Maybe he's too busy." Emily froze, her heart aching at the thought that even at such a young age, they were beginning to sense the gap in their family. She wanted to rush over, scoop them into her arms, and tell them they had everything they needed, but instead she stayed silent, tears slipping down her cheeks, knowing that one day the truth would demand to be told. The bus stop became part of their daily routine. Each morning Emily held their hands tightly as they waited for the bus to take her to work and the girls to preschool. They often played little games while they waited, Sophie pointing out passing cars while Lily tried to jump into puddles. It was in those ordinary moments that Emily felt both the weight and the beauty of her life. She had built stability from chaos, love from abandonment, and hope from despair. She didn't know that fate was quietly preparing to unravel everything she thought was settled, that the bus stop, so ordinary and unremarkable, would one day become the stage for the most shocking reunion of her life. The morning of the reunion began like any other, with Emily rushing to get Lily and Sophie dressed, their tiny arms slipping into coats while she tried to gather her work bag and their lunches. The girls were unusually energetic, laughing and chasing each other around the living room as though the rain outside had only fueled their excitement. Emily urged them gently to hurry, her mind already occupied with the deadlines that awaited her at work. She had grown used to balancing this constant pressure, but today her nerves felt more afraid than usual, as if something unseen was pressing against her chest. She brushed it off as exhaustion, kissed her daughters on the head, and guided them out the door toward the bus stop. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, the kind that promised a downpour at any moment, and the street glistened with the remnants of an earlier shower. The girls clutched her hands, one on each side, their boots splashing in shallow puddles as they skipped toward the shelter. Emily smiled despite her worries, watching how much joy they found in such simple things. The bus stop was already occupied by a few strangers, people she barely noticed as she adjusted her daughters' hoods and tried to keep them from running too far ahead. It was an ordinary morning in every visible sense, but her world was about to shift in a way she could never have prepared for. A sleek black car slowed to a stop at the corner, and though she wasn't paying attention, the man inside was. Ethan stepped out, his presence commanding as always, even more polished than she remembered. His dark hair, perfectly styled, and his sharp blue eyes made him stand out against the dull backdrop of the rainy morning. He had been heading to an early meeting downtown, his mind full of contracts and numbers, when his gaze had unexpectedly caught on a small group near the bus stop. Something about the two little girls held his attention, and the longer he looked, the harder it became to breathe. Emily didn't notice him at first. She was crouched down, tying Sophie's shoelace while Lily twirled nearby. But Ethan did notice her, and the sight struck him like a physical blow. Time seemed to collapse between them, pulling him back to the last time he had seen her, pregnant and begging him not to walk away. He remembered the cruel words he had thrown, the door he had closed, the life he had chosen to abandon. And now here she was, 3 years later, not alone as he had hoped or assumed, but with two identical little girls whose features mirrored his own in a way that was impossible to deny. His steps faltered as he approached, and Emily finally looked up. For a moment, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. The air left her lungs in a rush as recognition dawned, and her stomach twisted with a surge of emotions: anger, fear, shock, and something deeper she refused to name. She stood slowly, instinctively pulling her daughters closer as though to shield them, her protective instinct stronger than the storm inside her heart. The girls glanced up at the stranger, their wide blue eyes curious but unafraid. Ethan's gaze locked on them, and he felt the world tilt beneath him. The resemblance was undeniable: the same dark hair, the same piercing eyes that stared back at him from the mirror every morning. Questions surged through his mind, but the answers were already clear. He had 2 daughters, and he had missed everything: their first words, their first steps, their first years of life. The realization tore through him with such force that his carefully constructed composure nearly crumbled in public. Emily's voice broke the silence first, low and edged with steel. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" Her tone carried the weight of years of betrayal and survival, daring him to speak, to explain, to justify. But Ethan found himself unable to summon the arrogance he once wielded so easily. Instead, his throat tightened as he tried to respond, his eyes never leaving the girls who clung to her side. I didn't know," he whispered, the words barely audible, almost lost beneath the rumble of the approaching bus. The confession was raw, stripped of the authority and dominance that had once defined him. For the first time in years, Ethan Montgomery looked vulnerable. The bus pulled up, its brakes squealing as the doors opened, and Emily gripped her daughter's hands tightly. She turned her back to him, her voice steady but trembling underneath. "It doesn't matter anymore. We don't need you." The girls followed her onto the bus, their laughter echoing as they climbed the steps, unaware of the storm brewing between their mother and the man they had unknowingly called a stranger. Ethan stood in the rain, his heart hammering as the bus pulled away. For the first time, he felt the weight of his choices crash down upon him. He had chased wealth, power, and freedom, only to realize in a single fleeting moment at a bus stop that the greatest treasures he could ever have were the very ones he had thrown away. And as the bus disappeared into the gray horizon, he knew this was only the beginning. Ethan couldn't shake the image of Emily and the twins from his mind. That night, his penthouse felt colder than ever, its walls echoing with emptiness rather than the comfort of home. He walked through the expansive rooms, glass, marble, and steel shining under dim light, but the luxury only reminded him of how hollow his life had become. He poured himself a drink, but the burn of whiskey couldn't drown the memory of 2 little girls with his eyes looking up at him in curiosity, nor could it silence the echo of Emily's voice telling him they didn't need him. For years he had convinced himself that cutting her out was necessary, that he was sparing himself a life that would weigh him down, but now he realized he hadn't spared himself anything. He had carved out his own heart. The following days were torture. Every meeting blurred into one, every deal felt meaningless, and every night ended with him staring at the ceiling, haunted by the life he had walked away from. He replayed that morning at the bus stop endlessly, dissecting every detail: the way Emily had shielded the girls, the way their small hands had wrapped around hers, the spark of recognition in their features that made denial impossible. He wondered how Emily had survived without him, how she had managed to raise them on her own while he had continued living as though none of them existed. The guilt was suffocating. Meanwhile, Emily tried to return to normal, but the encounter unsettled her in ways she didn't want to admit. She had thought she was prepared for anything, that she had built walls high enough to keep Ethan's memory from piercing her. Yet seeing him again, so unexpectedly, had stirred emotions she hated herself for feeling. Anger came first, sharp and burning, but beneath it was a flicker of longing, a reminder of the man she had once loved before his ambition had destroyed them. That flicker frightened her more than the anger itself, and she resolved to bury it deep. She had no time for weakness, not when 2 little girls depended on her strength. The twins, however, seemed more curious than shaken. A few days later, Sophie asked, "Mommy, who was that man at the bus stop?" Emily hesitated, her heart lurching. She wanted to lie, to dismiss the question, but when Lily chimed in, "He looked like us," Emily's resolve wavered. She gathered them close and whispered, "He's just someone from the past, someone we don't need to worry about." Yet as she said it, she felt the weight of unspoken truth pressing against her chest. She knew that one day, the girls would demand real answers, and she feared how that conversation would shatter their world. Ethan, unable to stay away, began to watch from a distance. He had contacts everywhere, and it didn't take long to learn about Emily's modest life, the preschool the twins attended, the long hours Emily worked to provide for them. One evening he sat in his car across the street from the small apartment building where she lived, watching the light flicker in her window. He saw shadows of the girls dancing against the curtains, heard their laughter drifting faintly through the cool night air, and something inside him cracked. For all his success, for all his wealth, he had nothing compared to what she had: love, purpose, and a family. His first attempt to approach her again was clumsy. He caught her outside the grocery store, the twins tugging at her coat while she loaded bags into her arms. "Emily," he said, his voice softer than she remembered, stripped of arrogance. She froze, glaring at him with an intensity that nearly drove him back. "What do you want, Ethan?" she asked, her tone brittle. The twins looked between them, sensing tension but not understanding it. Ethan wanted to tell her everything, that he regretted it all, that he wanted to be part of their lives, that he would do anything to make it right, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he stammered, "I just want to talk." Emily's laugh was bitter, void of amusement. "Talk? After 3 years of silence? After you told me to handle it myself?" "I did handle it, Ethan. Without you. And they don't need you now." She pulled the girls closer, her jaw tight, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Ethan reached out instinctively, but she stepped back, her body shielding the twins like a fortress. The rejection cut deeper than any business failure ever could, but he didn't push. He knew he had no right. That night, Ethan sat in his car again, parked near her apartment, and whispered to himself, "I will make this right." For the first time, it wasn't about power or control or even redemption, it was about love, raw and desperate, for two little girls who didn't even know they belonged to him. He didn't yet know how he would prove it to Emily, but he vowed he wouldn't walk away again. Not this time. Ethan spent the following weeks trying to find a way back into Emily's world without tearing it apart. For the first time in his life, he found himself unsure of his next move. In the boardroom, he was decisive and ruthless, a man who thrived on risk and calculation. But when it came to Emily and the twins, every step felt like walking across glass. He wanted to show them he had changed, but he knew words alone would not erase 3 years of absence. Instead of forcing his presence on them, he began to act quietly. He arranged for an anonymous donor to cover part of the tuition at the girls' preschool, ensuring Emily would not have to carry that burden alone. He learned which grocery store she frequented and made sure an envelope of vouchers would somehow appear at the customer service desk in her name. He did not sign his gestures, fearing she would reject them if she knew they came from him, but for once his wealth was not about power. It was about giving them a small measure of relief. Emily noticed the sudden shifts in her life but refused to trust them. The tuition payment was a shock, and when the school explained it had been taken care of, she pressed for details, but they claimed confidentiality. At the grocery store, when she received unexpected credits, she felt uneasy rather than grateful, her instincts telling her Ethan had something to do with it. Though she never confronted him directly, her suspicions made her defensive, and she grew even more determined to keep him at arm's length. Her fear was not of his money but of his ability to once again destabilize the fragile world she had built with the twins. The girls, however, were blissfully unaware of these undercurrents. Their days were filled with laughter and exploration, and every small milestone reminded Emily why she had fought so hard to give them a stable life. One evening, as they painted pictures together at the kitchen table, Sophie dipped her brush in bright blue paint and smeared it across the paper. "Mommy," she asked softly, "why don't we have a daddy?" Emily's chest tightened, her hand pausing mid-stroke. Lily chimed in without hesitation, "We don't need one, we have you." The innocence in their voices made Emily smile and ache at the same time. She kissed their foreheads and whispered, "That's right, you have me. That's enough." Yet the lie sat heavy on her heart, because deep down she knew they deserved the truth one day. Ethan's determination grew with each passing day. He began leaving his office earlier, driving routes that allowed him to see the twins from a distance as Emily walked them home from preschool. He never approached, afraid of pushing her further away, but the simple act of watching them, hearing their laughter drift across the street, gave him a strange sense of hope. He found himself memorizing their habits, the way Lily always held her sister's hand as they crossed the street, the way Sophie tilted her head when she was curious about something, the way they both clung to Emily's arms when they were tired. They were pieces of him and pieces of her, and he marveled at the perfection of it. One Saturday afternoon, fate intervened again. Emily took the girls to the park, hoping the fresh air would tire them out. The twins ran ahead, squealing as they chased each other near the swings. Emily sat on a bench, her eyes constantly darting between them, her guard never lowered. Ethan had come to the park as well, hoping only to glimpse them, but when Sophie stumbled and scraped her knee, her cry pierced the air and he reacted instinctively. Before Emily could even reach her, Ethan was kneeling beside Sophie, pulling a clean handkerchief from his pocket and gently dabbing at the small wound. His voice was calm, soothing, his hands steady. Sophie sniffled but looked up at him with wide eyes, and for a moment the world stilled. Emily's heart pounded as she reached them, her breath quick with panic and anger. "Don't touch her," she snapped, pulling Sophie into her arms. Ethan froze, his jaw tightening, but he did not retreat. "I wasn't trying to overstep," he said quietly, "I just couldn't stand there while she was hurt." Emily's glare could have cut glass, but the girls looked between them with confusion. Lily tilted her head and asked innocently, "Mommy, is he our daddy?" The word sliced through the air like a blade, and Emily felt her world tilt. She hadn't expected the question to come so bluntly, not yet, not here. Ethan's eyes softened, his lips parting as though he might answer, but Emily's sharp voice silenced him. "No. He's not. He's just someone passing by." She took both girls by the hand, storming away before Ethan could follow. Yet as she walked, her chest ached, because Lily's question lingered in her mind and Sophie's small hand clutched her arm a little tighter, as if sensing that the truth was more complicated than Emily wanted to admit. That night, Ethan sat alone in his car, parked outside their building, and whispered into the silence, "They deserve the truth. And I will fight for it." For the first time, he understood that this was not just about winning Emily back, it was about becoming the father he should have been from the start, no matter how hard he had to fight to earn that right. Emily's resolve began to fracture after the scene in the park. She spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling as her daughters slept beside her in their small shared room, her mind consumed by the question Lily had asked. She had built her life around protecting them from Ethan's rejection, but now, with him appearing so suddenly and so persistently, she realized the truth could not remain buried forever. The girls were smart, perceptive, and as they grew older, their questions would only sharpen. Denying their father's existence was no longer possible, but acknowledging him felt like inviting chaos back into their lives. Torn between shielding them and giving them honesty, she felt herself unraveling in ways she hadn't in years. Ethan, on the other hand, was undergoing a transformation of his own. For the first time in his adult life, he began to prioritize something other than business. Meetings no longer held the same urgency, numbers blurred before his eyes, and his colleagues whispered about his distraction. He didn't care. He found himself lingering near playgrounds, coffee shops, even the streets Emily often walked, not to stalk but to remind himself of the reality he had ignored. These were not abstract children or some vague mistake from his past. They were flesh and blood, living proof of what he had abandoned, and the weight of that truth drove him into an unfamiliar place of humility. One evening, he stood outside Emily's apartment building, rehearsing words in his head. He had tried quiet gestures, small acts of support, but none of it could substitute for what he truly needed to say. When Emily finally emerged with the girls, holding their small backpacks as they skipped beside her, Ethan stepped forward. His presence froze her in place, her hand tightening on Lily's shoulder as though bracing for battle. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but not demanding. Emily shook her head, her eyes full of fire. "There is nothing to talk about. You made your choice." But then Sophie, ever the more sensitive twin, tugged at Emily's hand and looked up at Ethan with a tilt of her head. "Why do you always look at us like you know us?" The innocence in her question shattered the walls Emily had built, because she could see how the girls were beginning to connect the dots even without her words. Ethan dropped to one knee so he was at their level, his eyes glistening with a vulnerability Emily had never seen in him before. "Because I do know you," he whispered. His voice trembled as he looked at both girls. "I should have been here from the very beginning. I failed you and your mom, and I can never undo that. But I'm your father." Emily's breath caught, the confession hitting her like a tidal wave. She wanted to scream, to deny it, to protect her daughters from the storm she knew would follow, but Lily's wide eyes turned to her and asked softly, "Is it true, Mommy?" The silence stretched unbearably until Emily finally nodded, her throat tight with tears. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "He's your father." The girls stared at Ethan, their expressions a mix of wonder and confusion. They didn't run into his arms, but neither did they pull away. Instead, they looked to Emily for guidance, sensing the weight of her emotions. Ethan stayed on his knees, not daring to move closer, his heart pounding as he waited for any sign of acceptance. Emily's eyes locked on his, full of pain but also something deeper, an acknowledgement that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. She turned away quickly, leading the girls toward the bus stop, but the air between them had shifted irreversibly. That night, Emily wept quietly while the twins slept, her tears staining the pillow. For years she had carried the burden of his absence, the anger of his rejection, the exhaustion of raising two children alone. And now, with a single confession, he had forced open wounds she thought had scarred over. Yet despite her fury, she couldn't ignore the sincerity in his eyes, the way he had looked at Lily and Sophie not as strangers but as pieces of his soul. It terrified her, because it meant that as much as she wanted to keep him out, she could no longer pretend he didn't belong. Ethan, too, wept that night in his penthouse, the city lights blurring through his tears. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of regret. He replayed every moment of the day, the look on his daughters' faces when he spoke the truth, the sound of Emily's voice breaking as she confirmed it. He knew trust would not come easily, perhaps not at all, but he also knew he couldn't walk away again. He had lost too much already, and this time, he was willing to fight until he proved he could be the father they deserved. Weeks passed after Ethan's confession, and though nothing between them was resolved, everything had changed. Emily carried the weight of truth on her shoulders, watching as Lily and Sophie began to process the idea of having a father. At first, the twins spoke about him only in whispers, testing the word "dad" in their play as though it was fragile, something they weren't sure they were allowed to hold. Emily overheard them one evening building a tower of blocks, with Lily declaring, "Daddy will help us build bigger," and Sophie correcting softly, "But he's not really here yet." The innocent honesty pierced Emily's heart. She wanted to protect them from disappointment, but she knew the seed had been planted, and it would grow whether she liked it or not. Ethan, meanwhile, was determined not to squander the chance he had been given. He didn't push, knowing Emily's instinct was to shield the girls, but he found small, steady ways to show consistency. He began waiting at the bus stop every morning, not speaking unless Emily allowed, simply standing nearby until Lily or Sophie acknowledged him with shy smiles. On weekends, he made arrangements through the preschool to sponsor outings, always ensuring Emily knew he was behind it, hoping she would see that his efforts were not to buy their affection but to support the life she had fought to build. He wanted her to understand he was no longer the man who had abandoned her with cruel words but someone who had learned, painfully, that wealth meant nothing without family. One rainy Saturday, Emily allowed the girls to spend an hour with him at the park under her watchful eyes. Ethan brought nothing extravagant, only a kite he had chosen carefully, hoping it would speak louder than any gift. As the wind caught the fabric and the twins squealed with delight, running together to keep the string aloft, Emily stood in the distance, arms crossed, conflicted. She saw Ethan laugh, truly laugh in a way she hadn't seen in years, as he guided the girls, his hair damp from the drizzle, his once perfect suit jacket abandoned on the bench. The sight rattled her, because it reminded her of the man she had once loved, the man who could have been everything if only he had chosen differently. That evening, as she tucked Lily and Sophie into bed, Sophie whispered, "Mommy, can we see him again tomorrow?" Emily kissed her forehead, torn between fear and hope, and simply said, "We'll see." She retreated to the kitchen where she found herself staring at the rain streaming down the window, her mind replaying every moment of the day. The walls she had built were crumbling, not because she forgave him easily, but because she couldn't deny the way her daughter's eyes lit up when he was near. Ethan continued to show up, never demanding, never pushing, but always steady. Slowly, Emily allowed him to walk them home, then to join them for ice cream, then to sit at the kitchen table while the girls showed him their drawings. At first, she kept her guard high, ready to shut the door if he faltered, but over time she saw something she hadn't expected: patience. He didn't complain when Sophie spilled juice on his expensive shoes or when Lily grew shy and hid behind Emily's leg. He didn't pull out gifts to win them but instead offered his time, his attention, his presence. It unsettled her, because this was the Ethan she had prayed for years ago, and now that he was here, she didn't know how to let herself believe in him again. The turning point came one evening when the twins fell asleep on the couch after a movie. Ethan had stayed for dinner, quietly helping clean up, and as Emily lifted Sophie to carry her to bed, her arms trembled with fatigue. Ethan reached forward instinctively, taking Lily into his own arms, and Emily didn't stop him. He carried his daughter gently, his gaze fixed on her sleeping face, and when he laid her down beside her sister, he lingered for a moment, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. Emily watched from the doorway, and something inside her shifted. She saw not the arrogant CEO who had once dismissed her but a father, humbled and changed, who cherished what he had nearly lost forever. Later that night, when the girls were asleep, Emily confronted him in the quiet kitchen. "Why now, Ethan?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "Why after all these years?" He met her gaze without flinching, his voice raw. "Because I was a fool. I thought freedom meant walking away, but all I found was emptiness. Seeing you, seeing them, it broke me. I can't erase the past, Emily, but I will spend the rest of my life proving that I'm not that man anymore. I want to be their father, and if you'll let me, I'll earn back your trust piece by piece." Tears filled her eyes, not because she fully believed him yet, but because she wanted to. For so long she had carried everything alone, and the thought of sharing the weight, of letting him in, both terrified and comforted her. She whispered, "Don't make promises you can't keep," and turned away, but she didn't shut the door this time. Over the following months, their fragile arrangement grew into something stronger. The twins accepted him slowly, first with curiosity, then with affection, until one afternoon Lily ran into his arms at the bus stop and called him Daddy. The word shattered him, leaving him speechless as he hugged her tightly, tears streaming down his face. Emily stood nearby, her chest aching, and for the first time, she allowed herself to smile. By the end of that year, their lives had changed entirely. Ethan was no longer just a shadow at the edge of their routine, he had become part of their family's rhythm. There were still wounds, still nights when Emily lay awake wrestling with doubt, but there was also laughter, warmth, and the beginnings of forgiveness. What had once seemed impossible had taken root, and in the unlikeliest way, they had built a new life from the ruins of the old. Ethan had lost nearly everything before he realized what truly mattered, but when he finally looked across the table at Emily and their daughters, he knew he had found something greater than all his wealth combined. He had found redemption, love, and the family he had once thrown away, and this time, he would never let them go.